Walter Odom was 71 years old, and in 71 years he had learned exactly one thing about grief. It never announces itself. It doesn't knock. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It simply walks into your morning while the coffee is still too hot to drink and sits down across from you like it owns the chair. That was how it felt when he saw the gate standing open. The sky over Cedar Hollow was the color of a healing bruise, gray fading into something almost violet at the edges, and the air still carried the cold of the night before. Walter had been walking this same path to the creek for 46 years. First as a young man following his own father, then alone then, for a while, with a wife who had since passed and now alone again, except for an old blue heeler named Scout who limped a half-step behind him out of loyalty rather than duty. He heard the cattle before he understood why they mattered, not the low, bored complaining they usually made at sunrise. This was sharper, frightened. Walter's boots picked up speed before his brain had finished deciding to move. Then he saw it, the temporary fence he'd staked along the creek bank 3 weeks earlier, lying flat in the mud like it had been shoved down on purpose. 6 of his cows were standing where they had no business standing, hooves sunk deep into soft, churned earth that used to be solid pasture. The pond behind it, the pond that hadn't existed 2 months ago, the pond that had taken him from being the laughingstock of 3 counties to something closer to a local miracle, was draining out through a jagged tear in the dam like a wound that wouldn't close. No, Walter said to no one. No, no, no. He ran. 71 years old, bad hip and all, he ran toward that water like it was the last thing standing between him and everything he'd already buried. By the time he reached the bank, muddy water was rushing through the broken section in a brown ribbon, carrying sticks and torn grass downstream. One of the young cottonwoods he'd planted with his own hands, the one his late wife had joked would probably outlive both of us, lay snapped at its base. Scout stood beside him, ears flat, and made a low sound in her throat that wasn't quite a growl. Walter crouched at the edge of the broken dam, feeling the cold mud soak through the knees of his jeans, and for one long moment he simply stared at the damage the way a man stares at a hospital hallway. Then his eyes drifted past the wreckage toward the service road that ran along the property line. Tire tracks, narrow, deep, fresh, not his truck, not any equipment he owned. Someone had been here in the night. And judging by the deliberate, methodical way the dam had been torn apart, not trampled by a panicked animal, but pulled apart section by section, whoever it was hadn't been trespassing by accident. Walter Odom stood slowly, water dripping from his hands, and for the first time since the whole strange, improbable project began, he felt something other than hope or doubt. He felt certain that somebody wanted him to fail, and he intended to find out who. To understand how a 71-year-old farmer ended up on his knees in front of a beaver dam at dawn, you have to go back 3 months, to a June morning so dry the dust seemed to hang in the air out of sheer stubbornness. Cedar Hollow Farm sat on the edge of a river valley that had once been green enough to make outsiders assume the whole state looked that way. Walter's grandfather had cleared the first fields by hand. His father had built the barn that still stood sagging but proud at the top of the property. And Walter himself had spent 60 years watching Miller's Creek, the thin, winding vein of water that cut through his land, shrink a little more with each passing decade. That June it had shrunk almost to nothing. Where Walter remembered swimming as a boy who used to catch crawdads under the flat gray stones, there was now a cracked ribbon of mud with a few stagnant puddles scattered along its length like afterthoughts. His hay field, which used to give him 2 solid cuttings a season, had given him barely 1.5. His herd, once 60 head strong, had dwindled to 19 after 2 years of selling cattle just to keep the rest fed. His late wife, Eleanor, used to say that a farm doesn't die all at once. It dies the way a person forgets a language, one word at a time, until one day you realize you can't remember how to say the thing that used to come so easily. Walter had tried everything a stubborn old man with a modest bank account could try. He dug out silted irrigation channels with a shovel that left blisters on hands that had long since gone leathery. He'd hauled water in a rusted tank trailer behind his ancient pickup, gallon by gallon, to keep a few key pastures alive. He'd planted willow saplings along what was left of the bank, watching most of them wither within weeks because there simply wasn't enough moisture left in the soil to keep them going. He had also, reluctantly, and only because his knees ached too much most mornings to keep pretending otherwise, called a well-drilling outfit to ask about sinking a new well deep enough to reach water that hadn't already been claimed by everyone upstream. The man who answered was named Dale Kessler, and he ran the biggest drilling and irrigation company in the county, a business with shiny green trucks that seemed to appear like clockwork outside the property of any farmer unlucky enough to be struggling. Walter, Kessler had said, his voice smooth in the particular way of a man who has learned to make expensive things sound like common sense. The land doesn't owe you water just because your daddy farmed it. You want water, you go get it. New well, bigger pump, maybe some proper channel engineering while we're at it. The estimate had come in at just under $58,000. Walter had thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat at his kitchen table for a long time without moving. Doing the kind of math that doesn't require a pencil because the answer is already obvious. He did not have $58,000, and if the creek didn't recover soon, he wasn't going to have a farm either. It was his niece, of all people, who mentioned the wildlife group. Grace worked for a regional conservation nonprofit 2 counties over, and during one of her rare visits she'd walked the creek with him, frowning at the cracked mud the same way a doctor frowns at an x-ray. "Uncle Walt," she'd said, "have you ever thought about beavers?" Walter had laughed so hard he'd nearly choked on his coffee. "Beavers," he repeated, "you want me to hire rodents?" But Grace wasn't joking, and 2 days later she gave him the phone number of a wildlife biologist named Dr. Rene Castillo, who specialized in something Walter had never heard of in his life: beaver-based stream restoration. Dr. Castillo showed up at Cedar Hollow in a mud-splattered government truck, wearing boots that had clearly seen more creek bottoms than concrete floors, and carrying a clipboard she barely glanced at because she seemed to already know exactly what she was looking for. Walter had expected someone soft, some idealistic young person who'd read too many nature magazines. Instead, Dr. Castillo walked the creek bed with the brisk, no-nonsense energy of a woman who had spent her career getting laughed at by exactly this kind of skeptical old farmer, and had long since stopped caring. "Your water's moving too fast when it actually shows up," she said, crouching to examine the eroded banks. "Storms come through, the water rushes straight down this channel, cuts it deeper every time and leaves before it does you any good. It's not soaking into the ground. It's not recharging anything. And a beaver's supposed to fix that. A beaver dam slows the water down," she said. "Creates ponds, wetlands, gives the water time to sink in instead of racing off downstream. Water table rises, banks stabilize, vegetation comes back. It's not magic, Mr. Odom. It's just what beavers have been doing to landscapes for millions of years, until we mostly wiped them out and forgot how much we needed them." Walter crossed his arms, unconvinced but too curious to walk away. "And what happens when they decide to chew down every tree I've got left or flood my hay barn?" "You manage them," she said simply. "You protect the trees you care about, you watch water levels, you use fencing in the right places. It's not passive, it's a partnership. But on land like this, with a channel this degraded, it can do in a season or two what heavy machinery would take years and a small fortune to accomplish." Walter looked at the dying creek, then at his thinning herd standing in whatever patchy shade they could find, then back at Dr. Castillo. "So my options," he said slowly, "are a $58,000 well or a pair of beavers with a chewing habit." For the first time, Dr. Castillo almost smiled. "Pretty much." 2 weeks later, a wildlife transport truck rolled down Walter's gravel driveway carrying 2 wooden crates and a mated pair of beavers that had been relocated from a drainage ditch near a highway, where they'd been causing exactly the kind of trouble that usually ends with an animal control call instead of a second chance. His neighbor, a wiry, perpetually amused man named Pete Havorson, was leaning on the fence line before the truck had even finished parking. "Walter," Pete called out, grinning ear to ear, "please tell me you didn't just buy yourself some giant water rats." "They're a loan, not a purchase," Walter said, though he wasn't entirely sure that made it sound better. Pete laughed so hard he had to grab the fence post to stay upright. 71 years old and starting a rodent ranch. "Eleanor would have had something to say about this." "Eleanor," Walter said, "would have been down there helping me build the dam herself." That at least shut Pete up for a moment. The first 2 weeks were, by any honest measure, a disaster. The beavers ignored the careful spot Walter had picked out for them and instead settled into a bend of the creek nowhere near where he'd expected. They chewed through 2 of his remaining willow saplings within days. One morning he found a trail of gnaw marks leading straight to a stack of fence posts near the barn, where one of the animals had apparently decided fresh-cut lumber was a more efficient building material than anything available in the actual creek. Pete found new material for jokes almost daily. Somebody in town, Walter never did find out who, took a photograph of him standing knee-deep in creek mud trying to wrap wire mesh around a cottonwood trunk, while one of the beavers floated nearby like an unimpressed foreman, and posted it online with the caption, "Cedar Hollow's newest employee just clocked in." The comments were not kind. At the feed store, 2 men he'd known since childhood started making slapping sounds with their palms whenever he walked past, mimicking a beaver's tail hitting water. Somebody suggested, loudly enough for half the store to hear, that Walter had finally lost whatever sense he had left. He smiled through most of it, the way you learn to when you've buried a wife and outlived most of your own excuses for caring what people think. But every evening, once the store closed and the jokes quieted down, he walked the creek alone with Scout checking, and then slowly, almost too slowly to notice, something changed. A puddle that should have dried out by nightfall was still there in the morning, then another. A thin, rippling sheet of water began spreading out behind the beaver's first rough dam, an ugly, lopsided tangle of sticks, mud, and grass that looked more like debris than architecture. But it held. After a short, unremarkable thunderstorm, the kind of rain that used to vanish from his creek bed within hours, Walter walked down expecting the usual disappointment. Instead, the water was still there. Quiet, brown, real. He knelt at the edge and pressed 2 fingers into it, as if he needed to confirm with his own hands what his eyes were already telling him. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly. A week after that, the grass near the bank had changed, not lush, not the meadow of his childhood, but alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Thin green shoots pushed up through cracked soil that had been bone-dry for 2 summers. The mud stayed damp longer into the day. Birds started showing up in the early mornings, red-winged blackbirds first, then a heron that landed so awkwardly Walter laughed out loud for the first time in what felt like months. Even his cattle noticed. They stopped crowding the old metal trough near the barn and started wandering, almost cautiously, back toward the creek. Walter recorded a short video on the outdated phone Grace had insisted he learn to use, panning slowly from the dry pasture uphill down to the small, stubborn pond forming behind the dam. "Everybody in town thinks I've officially lost my mind," he said to the camera, feeling foolish and a little proud at the same time. "This creek bed was cracked mud 3 weeks ago, now look at it. My 2 new hired hands built this, not me. So go ahead and laugh, but these 2 might know more about water than every drilling company in the county put together." He posted it that night without expecting much. By morning, it had a few hundred views. By the following afternoon, a regional farming page had shared it. By the end of the week, his phone, which usually rang only for doctors' appointments and telemarketers, was ringing with calls from strangers who wanted to know how it worked. Not everyone was convinced. Some still called it a stunt. But a hay farmer 40 miles east asked for Dr. Castillo's number. A schoolteacher asked if her class could visit in the fall. For the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, Walter slept through the night without waking at 3 a.m. To do math, he already knew the answer to. That piece lasted exactly until Dale Kessler decided to pay a visit. Kessler arrived on a Tuesday, driving a green truck so freshly washed it looked out of place on Walter's gravel road, wearing pressed khakis and a shirt too crisp for anyone who claimed to work outdoors for a living. Walter was repairing a fence line near the creek when the truck pulled up, and he didn't bother straightening up right away. "Walter," Kessler said, stepping out with the easy grin of a man who had never once doubted his own charm. "Heard you've got yourself quite the science experiment down here." "Morning, Dale." Kessler looked past him toward the small, glittering pond and let out a short laugh. "I've seen folks try some strange things when the bank account gets tight, but beavers. That's a new one even for this county." Walter kept working the wire in his hands. "They're helping for now." "For now," Kessler repeated like the phrase amused him. "Until they flood your pasture, or chew down every tree you've got left, or plug up something they've got no business plugging. Water's serious business, Walter. You don't hand it over to rodents and hope for the best." Walter finally straightened, ignoring the stiffness in his back. "Nobody handed them anything, they're part of a plan." "A plan?" Kessler shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a child who has just explained something obviously incorrect. "I build water systems for a living, Walter, real systems, engineered. You need a proper well and channel work, not a swamp full of sticks. Can't afford your well, Dale, you know that." Something in Kessler's easy smile flattened just slightly into something colder. "Can't afford to be wrong either." He left without saying much else, and Walter told himself the visit didn't bother him. He was lying, and he knew it. The rumors started small, the way rumors usually do, drifting through the county the way smoke drifts through a house before anyone notices the fire. Someone posted online that Walter's beaver ponds were contaminating the creek. Someone else claimed the water was breeding mosquitoes by the thousands. A comment from an account with no profile picture insisted the pond smelled like sewage. Another said his cattle were getting sick drinking from stagnant beaver waste. Then came the claim that worried Walter most, that his little experiment could eventually flood neighboring land and damage irrigation systems downstream. Walter had a strong suspicion where all of it was coming from. Suspecting and proving, though, were 2 very different things. At the next livestock auction, people who used to nod at him from across the yard suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else. A local diner that had bought a small amount of beef from him each season called to say they wanted to wait and see how things developed before placing another order. That evening, Walter sat at his kitchen table with a stack of unpaid bills, a cup of coffee gone cold, and a county water notice he'd read 4 times without fully understanding it. Scout lay at his feet, sensing the way dogs do that something in the house had gone heavy. Grace showed up without calling first, the same way she'd done since she was a teenager. "You look terrible, Uncle Walt. Good to see you too." She picked up one of the bills and frowned at it. "This is about the rumors." "It's about the rumors, the bills, the creek, the fact that I may have invited 2 semi-aquatic outlaws onto my own property," Walter said, rubbing his eyes. "Kessler knows how to scare people, Grace. He says flood, they hear lawsuit. He says dirty water, they hear disease. Doesn't matter what's actually true if everybody panics before they've had a chance to look for themselves." Grace sat across from him thinking. "Then don't let them panic in the dark. Show them the truth before he gets to tell it for you. Show them how. Invite people out. Let Dr. Castillo explain the science. Take real measurements. Make it as boring and factual as humanly possible. People trust what they can see with their own eyes, not what they hear secondhand at a feed store." Walter almost laughed. "Boring, right? Boring," Grace agreed, "is exactly what you need." So Walter tried louder. He invited neighbors, ranchers from 3 counties over, the county extension office, a reporter from the regional paper, and anyone else curious enough to show up and see for themselves. He cleaned out the barn, printed a set of before and after photographs Grace had helped him organize, and marked a safe walking path with orange flags along the bank. Dr. Castillo arrived early with water testing kits, and the calm, unhurried demeanor of someone who had diffused far more hostile crowds than this one was likely to be. Walter barely slept the night before, imagining every possible disaster: a beaver biting a child, a cow wandering into the test area, Pete cracking a joke loud enough to end up as the newspaper's headline. None of it happened. The Beavers, for once in their brief, chaotic residency, behaved like seasoned professionals. One swam calmly across the pond with a fresh branch in its mouth, while a dozen people stood filming in near-reverent silence. The other climbed onto the bank, shook the water from its coat, and ambled back toward the dam as though it had somewhere important to be. Kids loved them instantly. Adults pretended not to and then quietly filmed anyway. Dr. Castillo walked the group through the science in plain, patient language. How slowing the water gave the soil time to absorb it, how the murky runoff at the edges looked different from the water that had settled and cleared in the pond, how new grasses and sedges were already taking root along the bank. Walter showed them the wire mesh protecting his few remaining mature trees, the temporary fencing keeping cattle away from the most fragile ground, the small notebook where he logged water levels every single morning. Pete showed up too, and for once didn't crack a single joke, at least not loudly enough for Walter to hear. That evening, the reporter posted an article with the headline, "The Beavers Bringing Water Back to Cedar Hollow." The comments this time were different. People asked real questions instead of repeating rumors. A few of the loudest doubters sent quiet, almost sheepish messages asking if they could stop by another time when there wasn't a crowd. The diner called back and said they were comfortable placing their order after all. Even the county water office admitted somewhat grudgingly that Walter's setup looked more organized than they'd expected from a backyard operation. For 2 full days, Walter let himself believe the worst was behind him. Then, the night before the county's follow-up inspection, someone destroyed the dam. This is where the story began. Walter on his knees in the mud at dawn, staring at torn earth and a stranger's tire tracks, with his cattle standing frightened in ground that should never have been opened to them. By 7:30, Grace was there. By 8, Dr. Castillo had arrived, her calm expression cracking slightly at the sight of the damage. By 9, the county inspector stood at the edge of the ruined bank, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "I'm not saying you did this, Mr. Odom," he said carefully, "but I can't approve the site in this condition. We'll need to reschedule once it stabilizes." Walter nodded, because if he'd opened his mouth right then, he wasn't sure whether words or something worse would come out. After the inspector left, Walter crouched by the broken dam, his jeans soaked through, his hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Scout pressed her graying muzzle gently against his shoulder, and for the first time since he'd buried a leaner, Walter cried beside that creek, not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet, exhausted tears falling into mud that had only just started remembering how to be alive. Dale Kessler arrived less than an hour later. That, more than anything, told Walter everything he needed to know. Kessler stepped out of his truck wearing an expression of concern that never quite made it to his eyes. "Walter, I heard there was trouble out here." Walter stood slowly. "How exactly did you hear that so fast?" Kessler shrugged. "Small county people talk. They talk fast," Walter said. Kessler glanced toward the broken dam and shook his head almost sorrowfully. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You can't control wild animals, Walter. You can't build a real water system out of sticks and good intentions. You drove all the way out here just to tell me that." "I drove out here to help," Kessler said. "I can have a crew out tomorrow. Clear this whole mess, cut a proper channel, and finally start talking seriously about that well." "A real well," Walter repeated slowly. Kessler smiled, gentle and reasonable. "Before things get worse." Something in his tone and the practiced softness of it made the grief in Walter's chest curdle into something else entirely. Anger, clean and sudden. "That dam didn't break on its own, Dale," Walter said. "It was torn apart section by section, like somebody knew exactly what they were doing." Kessler's smile thinned. "Careful, Walter. Grief and stress have a way of making a man imagine things that aren't there." Walter didn't answer right away. His eyes had drifted past Kessler toward the service road that ran along the edge of his property, toward the same tire tracks he'd noticed at dawn. Narrow, deep, fresh, not his truck, not any machine he owned. And then he remembered something else. 2 months earlier, after a string of coyotes had gotten uncomfortably close to his calving, Pen Grace had helped him set up a pair of trail cameras. One aimed at the barn, one tucked into the brush near the creek, angled toward the very stretch of bank that had just been destroyed. Walter hadn't looked at that second camera in weeks. He said nothing to Kessler. He simply turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the man standing alone by the water he'd claimed to want to save. That afternoon, with Grace and Dr. Castillo standing behind his chair, Walter pulled up the trail camera footage on the laptop Grace had bought him 2 Christmases ago and never quite trusted him to use properly. For a long stretch, there was nothing, darkness, wind moving through dry grass. A raccoon passing close to the lens, its eyes flaring white in the infrared glow. Then, at 2:14 in the morning, headlights swept briefly across the frame. An ATV rolled slowly into view along the service road. The rider wore a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. But as he turned to dismount, the camera caught the side of his profile clearly enough to leave no room for doubt. Walter stopped breathing. The man walked straight to the temporary fence and opened the gate without hesitation, the way someone moves when they already know exactly where everything is. Then he crossed to the dam carrying a long metal rake and began pulling it apart methodically, one section at a time, not the frantic motion of anger, but the careful, deliberate motion of someone staging a disaster to look accidental. He scattered a bag of feed near the softest part of the bank before he left. The cattle wandered into frame 10 minutes later, drawn by the smell. The man returned to his ATV, and as he climbed on, he turned once more toward the camera, giving it and Walter a clear, unmistakable look at his face. Dale Kessler. Nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Then Walter began to laugh, not a happy sound, but the particular kind of laugh that escapes a person when their chest has been carrying something too heavy for too long and finally finds somewhere to set it down. "You absolute fool," he said quietly, shaking his head at the frozen image on the screen. "You had to be there yourself, didn't you?" By noon, the sheriff's office had a copy of the footage. By early afternoon, the county inspector had seen it as well. By that evening, the regional reporter had posted an update with a blunt, unambiguous headline: "Cedar Hollow's beavers were framed." The reaction was immediate. Neighbors who had doubted Walter began apologizing, some in person, some through hastily typed messages they clearly regretted not sending sooner. Ranchers who had quietly stayed out of the drama showed up the next morning to help repair the fence line, saying little, working steadily, the way people do when an apology feels better spoken through labor than words. Kessler denied everything at first. He claimed the footage was too blurry to prove anything. He claimed he'd simply been checking on a nearby job site that had nothing to do with Cedar Hollow. He implied, not so subtly, that Walter was a desperate old man looking to blame someone else for his own mistakes. But the footage was clear, and once people started looking closer, more pieces began falling into place. Two ranchers admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that Kessler had privately warned them against getting involved with Odom's beaver nonsense. A former employee of Kessler's company came forward to say his old boss had joked more than once about teaching the county a lesson before every struggling farmer started hiring wildlife biologists instead of drilling crews. The reputation Kessler had spent years polishing didn't just crack, it shattered. The dam itself was repaired within days, not by a machine but by a crowd of muddy, mostly forgiven volunteers. Pete showed up with fence posts and for the first time in weeks, absolutely nothing funny to say. Grace brought sandwiches and a level of organizational energy Walter suspected she'd inherited from her Aunt Alina. Dr. Castillo brought tools, patience, and a plan. The Beavers, notably unbothered by the human chaos surrounding their home, helped too, though nobody in the crowd wanted to admit how much credit they deserved. Within 3 nights, they'd patched the damaged section themselves with sticks, mud, and the same stubborn, unshakable confidence they'd carried since the day they arrived. 2 weeks later, the county inspector returned. This time, the water was clear enough to make out the shadows of small insects skimming along its surface. The bank, though still rough in places, had stabilized. Grass had taken root in patches where there had only ever been dust. The cattle grazed calmly beyond a new stretch of fencing, with a separate watering point set up safely downstream of the fragile restoration area. The inspector studied the creek for a long moment, then looked at Walter. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Odom. I didn't expect this to actually work." Walter allowed himself a small, tired smile. Neither did most of the county. The inspector signed the approval. By early autumn, Cedar Hollow Farm looked different, not saved forever, because Walter, of all people, knew better than to believe one good season could undo years of drought. 2 beavers weren't going to solve every water problem in the region. The land still needed careful management, better fencing, more planting, and no small amount of patience. But the creek was holding water longer than it had in years. The pasture near the bank stayed green well after the surrounding hills had turned the familiar dry gold of late summer. Willow shoots pushed up along the water's edge. Birds gathered each morning the way they hadn't since Walter was a boy. Frogs returned to one of the smaller ponds, and the first evening he heard them singing, he stood on the bank for nearly 10 minutes without moving, smiling in a way he hadn't in longer than he cared to count. His cattle put weight back on. His hayfield, for the first time in 3 years, gave him a second cutting worth harvesting. And people kept coming, ranchers, students, reporters, a county water advisory group, and more than a few skeptical old-timers who insisted they were just passing through, despite the fact that Cedar Hollow sat at the very end of a dead-end gravel road. One Saturday morning, Walter stood at the edge of the creek in front of a small crowd of farmers and ranchers from 3 different counties, some curious, some still openly doubtful. A few of them wore the exact same tired, worried expression Walter recognized from his own reflection months earlier, the look of people almost out of options. He understood that look better than anyone standing there. "They're not magic," he told the group, nodding toward the pond where one of the beavers floated with only its head above the surface. "They're animals. They'll chew things you wish they wouldn't touch. They'll build where you'd rather they didn't. They need space, planning, fencing, and someone willing to pay attention every single day. You can't just drop a pair of beavers into a dying creek and expect a miracle." A few people chuckled. But Walter continued, "When the land is right and when you work with them instead of fighting them, they can do something no engineer I've ever met could do for the price. They slow the water down, they keep it here longer. They turn dry ground back into something living. And sometimes that's the difference between a creek that disappears every July and one that gives your farm a fighting chance." The group fell quiet for a moment. Then Pete, standing near the back with his arms crossed and a grin he could no longer contain, raised his hand. "So where exactly do we sign up for the Giant River Rat program, Walter?" Everybody laughed. Walter laughed hardest of all. That evening, once the crowd had gone home, Walter walked the creek alone, Scout limping along beside him at her usual half-step distance. The sun hung low over the valley, turning the water a soft, burnished gold. The air smelled like wet earth, cut grass, and cottonwood leaves, a smell Walter hadn't realized he'd missed until it came back. He stopped near the first dam, watching the two beavers work in the fading light. One dragged a fresh branch through the shallows. The other pressed mud carefully into a small gap along the structure, utterly absorbed in the task, as though nothing in the world mattered more than getting that one seam exactly right. Walter thought about all the people who had laughed at him. He thought about Kessler's polished truck and practiced concern. He thought about the morning he'd found the gate open and believed, for a few terrible hours, that everything was already lost. Then he thought about his father, who used to stand on this same bank decades earlier and say the same simple thing every summer. "Water is the first crop, son. Everything else comes after." For the first time in a long while, Walter felt certain his father, and Alina, wherever she was, would be proud of him. Not because the farm had become the subject of newspaper articles. Not because strangers now called him things like the Beaver Man of Cedar Hollow, a nickname he still hadn't fully forgiven anyone for, but because he had stayed, because he had paid attention. Because he had finally stopped trying to force the land into behaving like a machine and started listening to what it had been trying to tell him all along. Grace walked up behind him, carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea. "You know," she said, handing one over, "you're something of a local legend now, Uncle Walt. Please don't say that. Too late, Beaver King of the county. I hate that." "No," Grace said, smiling, "you don't." Across the pond, one of the beavers slapped its tail against the water hard enough to make Scout jump. Grace pointed at it, laughing. "See, even they agree." Walter laughed too, longer than he had in years. By the following month, Cedar Hollow Farm had a waiting list for visits. A regional agricultural magazine ran a feature. Schools scheduled field trips for the spring. The diner that had once hesitated to buy his beef now proudly listed it on the menu with a small note about water-conscious ranching. Even Pete, half joking and half serious, asked if Dr. Castillo might take a look at the creek running through his own lower pasture. Walter made him ask twice, not out of spite, just because he wanted to enjoy it a little longer. On the first cool morning of October, Walter stood by the front gate as the sun rose slowly over the valley. The hills beyond his fence line were still dry, and the future, as always in farming, remained uncertain, because the land never lets a person feel safe for too long. But down below, Cedar Hollow's creek moved slowly through the pasture. Not fast, not wasted, not gone. It curved gently around the first dam, spread into a quiet pond, sank into the thirsty banks, and carried just enough morning light to make the whole valley look, for the first time in years, genuinely alive. One beaver swam across the water with a fresh branch in its mouth. The other followed close behind. Walter leaned against the fence and watched them work, muddy, stubborn, endlessly inconvenient, and decided, after everything they'd all been through together, that they had more than earned the right to be exactly that.